All right, welcome to part two of the guidance on peer reviewing in HCI. And this one is focused on actually doing the job of the review. So the last video was about understanding the conference or journal that you're reviewing for, but now we're talking about actually, okay, you're going to do the review. What's the way to do it really well? And one thing I'll point out at this point is we might be able to add a link to this video is that there's some great community guidance that goes into lots of these issues and much greater detail that you can read. And this has been co-generated by many people. What I'm hoping I can do in this is elaborate a bit more on some of the reasoning behind how we do things in different ways and what your responsibilities are. So in this particular video, I'm going to go through three things. One is the process of reading, which is just as important as then the approach to writing a review. And then different ways of structuring a review is the kind of final advice I want to give. First, though, let's look at the reviewer responsibilities. There's actually quite a lot of kind of research and publishing into the process of reviewing. So plenty you can read about if you want to read it academically. One nice quote from 1989 from a paper with the desirable traits of a referee or a reviewer is objectivity, fairness, speed, professionalism, confidentiality, honesty, and courtesy. So all of these aspects are kind of equal importance. You've got to be objective, not be biased by perhaps someone you know as a friend, or people you think have done good work. You'll actually review the paper objectively, be fair about it, be on time, be professional, keep things confidential, be honest about what you're doing because you're ultimately working towards good science, and be courteous to the reviewers. A common mistake is to be rude about the paper, but actually what you want to do is actually point 4 on this list is give constructive feedback to authors in a polite way. So what we want really from reviewers is to inform the program committee or senior reviewers or editors, whoever the people above us in the process are, whether the paper is suitable to be part of their venue, to be published in the venue. Your aim is to identify faults with the current paper, both in terms of the technicality of the work, but also how it's presented. And to confirm that what they're writing in this paper is novel and therefore publishable in that sense. And then to give feedback to the authors about improving it. There's one quote which I've since lost the exact reference to. I can't remember as a person or from the same Parbury 1989 paper, but they're saying essentially reviews, especially hastily written and overly critical reviews, often do more harm than good. A good review is constructive and reflective and provides guidance to both the senior reviewers and to the authors. So here's the quick overview, the kind of 6 steps you're going to be involved in. First of all is agreeing to do the review in the first place. You need to do that in a timely manner when asked. One thing that's frustrating is if a senior reviewer has invited people to review and they never actually press yes or no. They just kind of don't reply, and then later on they go, oh yeah, I can do that. And meantime, the senior reviewer is panicking. But don't do it if it's not your area or you don't have time or you're conflicted. Make sure you know reasons not to review something, because it could be a good opportunity to review, but just because it's a good opportunity doesn't mean that you should. There are lots of types of HCI papers that I'm not an expert in and wouldn't be a good reviewer for, so I know not to say yes to those. The second step would say is reactive fast reading, and I'll explain this more later, but just a get overview type reading, not kind of deep reading. The third step is the deep reading, where you go into stuff in detail. And then really important is the rest and think stage. Ideally, you want to build enough time into your reviewing that you actually get the chance to rest and think. And then there's drafting all parts of the review, and then to double check stuff and submit stuff is the 6th step. But we'll go into these in more detail. One thing I produced recently for someone else when we're discussing peer review is this is a diagram I created about the way that I review papers in detail. So the top bit is the kind of quick reading activities, and hopefully we'll get this as a version that you'll be able to look at in more detail. The second level is the deep reading and reviewing stage. And the third level is the deciding what you're going to say in your review when you write it. And so there's quick readings at the top with occasional notes, and copying key information off to the side is really just about getting to understand the paper that you're about to review. And it's just as important you understand what it is before you review it than it is to actually do the review. So before I then begin the proper reviewing, I have this sort of step back and I think about what I expect of this paper given my understanding I gained from the quick review. And that's when I go into the deep reading of writing down my thoughts about what they've said, deciding if things or aspects are good and bad, checking key information that they've said, checking whether or not stats have been done right, for example, adding to my notes, looking at other papers if there's relevant other papers to decide whether what they've done is relevant. That's all that deep reviewing activity, the deep reading. And then the third layer with the writing the review is to decide what is the best way for me as a reviewer to explain what I think of the paper and whether it's ready to accept. And then to write it, to draft it somewhere. And I always draft it somewhere else, just because sometimes websites time out and then you lose stuff, and that's just hours of work gone. Then there's like often a job of like gathering some extra data, gathering that reference you wanted them to add, getting the actual detail in, and that's an important step to remember to do. And then to combine it all and put it into the review system. So there's actually quite a lot of steps involved. When you really unpack it, it's got all these bits in it, which I think are equally important in what you're doing. And I'm sure other people may have similar guidance or other steps they do. And it does vary a little bit for types of paper. There's some papers where your job is to decide if the code actually works, if the code, the system that's been built is novel. And that's different to evaluating a user study and experiment. So there's some varying aspects within these levels, but ultimately the quick read is just as important as the deep read. And that's just as important as deciding how you're going to write the review when you do it. So this fast skim reading, let's talk about that. This is really to get the big picture, to understand roughly why they did the work, what they've done, how they've done it, and what the results were, as quickly as possible to establish that understanding. I often start by reading the abstract and then looking at the references just to see what it's kind of all about, and then start to think about what I'm expecting the rest of the paper to kind of say, to see if it all lines up. Then I look at the main body, and not necessarily in order. Like I often would read about the methods to understand kind of what methods are done in the paper. And then, because I'm not yet reading the deep level of everything, I just want to know what's in the paper. And the reason we do this is a common mistake is to get bogged down in this detailed reading, which is the next step really, and actually realize there could be something at the higher level, which means A, you shouldn't be reviewing it, or B, it's definitely rejected because they've done something wrong, or C, that there's key elements that are going to be missing, which need focus on when you do the proper reviewing. So you can often, I've done it before, where I've got to the end of the few weeks of the reviewing period. I'm like, oh, I haven't done my review yet. The deadline's tomorrow, and I really should have done it already. And then I open up the paper and I go, oh no, I'm conflicted with this. I can't review it. And so you have to go back and tell the senior reviewer, oh no, sorry, I can't do it. And that's just not good for any situation. So luckily that hasn't happened often, but it did happen to me once. So as a good reviewer, my job would be to fast skim read it early on. And that was one lesson I learned. So then once you've done that though, then you can read again with purpose. And so the fast read might be like 20 minutes looking at all the different bits of the paper. The deep read is where you would spend whatever it is you spend in time reviewing a paper, where you really go into it. Like, what is the argument they're making? Is it clear and well organized and logical as an argument? Have they got the right areas of literature? Have they synthesized them well? Really, it's all these. We could go through all of these in detail, and you could look at this slide as much as you want. But really, it's the time when you're asking these deep questions. Have they done this right? Is the method right? Is there enough detail in the method? Have they done the reporting of results correct? Are the stats correct? Are the graphs good? You're really judging the deep detail of everything. A good one is that last one. Does the conclusion match the work they've done? Because sometimes you get papers where they're like, the conclusion is what they've come to understand as a reviewer, but not what the paper concludes from the work. And I made that mistake as an author once. I was like, here's the study we did, here's the results. What I learned was, and I kind of went off on a tangent, and actually the conclusion of the paper didn't really match what the work we'd done. And that was the feedback we got in the review, which was great. That's what the reviews are for. So then you need this reflect and think, and this reflect and think is really important. And I try and always separate a different day between when I read papers and when I actually write reviews. And if it's not a day, then I hope it's at least a lunch break or a time in between. And that's when I can sit and I walk off and I think about, what was that paper really doing? Was that novel? Was that important? Does it really deliver what it said it was going to deliver? What are the really good things I can say about it? Because I have to say good things as well. And what's really the underlying issues that are wrong with it? And we must keep remembering, we're always thinking things that might be wrong with the paper. It's sometimes easy to accidentally go into, oh, you didn't do this, or you didn't do that. And you should always remember the paper doesn't have the right method detail. because we're critiquing this object they've created, not how good a person is at doing a job of writing a paper. So remember, go back, this paper doesn't have this. There's some more information that would be ideal in the paper to make the paper make more sense. We're always judging the paper. And then think about what type of feedback you would like to receive about this paper if this was your paper, or if you were going to comment on your colleague's paper, your co-PhD student's paper, or the other people you work with, or just friends around the world. What do they want in terms of feedback? They want to know what possible weaknesses there are about the paper and what you think they could do to make it stronger. And that's really part of your job as a reviewer, is to have that type of advice, not to just be like, this is bad, that sucks, we should reject the paper. We want to be constructive. So then you can keep thinking about what it's really doing. Like, is it describing a clear problem? Is that problem important? Does it have a clear contribution? Did they ever really say what we did was contribute this? And can they articulate that? Can you articulate it having read it? Because if they didn't do it and you didn't do it, probably the paper isn't really ready yet. And is there really enough evidence in there to support that contribution, or is there some weakness in the steps between? And it's this point, after you've thought all those things, this is when I start going, okay, what did the conference want me to comment on? They often should provide you with, and this is actually from CHI 2005, so this is quite old stuff, and it's typically these things come up in different conferences, different journals, but they're all ultimately looking for these kind of things. And what you seem to do is go, okay, what can I say about how relevant and suitable this is to the conference? Does it match well with the conference? How am I going to explain that from my thoughts so far? How novel and original is this contribution? How important and big is this contribution? What do I think about the literature? How well is the work done, or how well is the work reported in the paper? And then are there clear implications from what's done? Because that's what the conference wanted me to judge on. So I'm thinking about how do I comment on those from all my thoughts so far. That's like a translation between my thoughts and what they want to hear. So then I'm at the point where, okay, I've thought about what I want to say about each of the criteria. Now I'm at the point where I'm ready to say, are these big problems or small problems? Because a really common mistake in review is that people list problems but never really discuss how big or important they are. And then it doesn't make sense from there why they've made a recommendation. So we once had a review that came in and it was 20 bullet points, some of which were like, the caption on that figure doesn't make sense. And then the outcome was reject. I was like, okay, which of those 20 bullet points was big? Which of those bullet points mattered? Which of those bullet points made them decide reject? And I need to be able to understand that as a senior reviewer. So it's this point you're deciding, is this issue that I've identified major or not? Is it worth rejecting something about or not? Is this something major that needs fixing or not? So if it's something that's maybe easily fixable, like, just need a little bit more detail on this topic so that it's got, the degrees of freedom in the statistics was maybe missed. These are minor. These are things that could be fixed in a final version of the paper and don't really need to be re-reviewed. Maybe the degree of freedom does. But if there's small things you want to change, it's not big. Probably it's a minor change. If it's ambiguous or unclear whether they've done something right, that's sometimes a question that makes it difficult. In a journal, I would say that is probably not a big thing because you can ask them to clarify in the next version. And then it's time for you to go, oh my goodness, that was done wrong when they clarify. But you got to decide, could this, regardless of what they say about that clarification, we assume they did it well. Can we accept it based on that premise? Because is it probably acceptable? So you can decide, is that minor or big? If there's something fundamental to the paper, then it probably is a big major issue. Like if there's a key bit of literature which they didn't cite, which means this whole paper is not novel, it means their introduction wasn't clear, it means their related work was incomplete, it means their method and results aren't described in relation to the best knowledge or previous knowledge that existed, and it means their discussion isn't in light of the previous paper. So this one paper, if it's so fundamental, might have changed the whole paper you're reviewing. So if it's that fundamental to the paper, then it's a major problem. It needs to be either rejected at this point or given a chance for major revisions if that exists. If it's fundamental to the research they did, like they made a mistake in the research process, or at least in how they defined it, then at that point, that's almost definitely a major revision or a reason to reject the paper. Things that are minor is kind of just limitations to the paper that are ultimately outweighed by the positives. But sometimes you do get to a point where you're like, there's quite a lot of minor, and I think it needs to be reviewed again after those minor changes. And so that does it need to be reviewed again question is often a good reflective point for your review. If you think you need to review it again because you can't decide if it's acceptable or not, then that tells you it needs to be revised. And if there's no revision cycle, then it tells you it needs to be rejected. But if you think they can clarify a few bits, improve that little bit, add a reference they missed, but it's not critical, and then it would be acceptable regardless without you needing to review it again, then at that point you're erring on recommending accept for it. Some other possible problems you might want to look at. There's things like, did it break anonymity? Does it matter if they broke anonymity? If it matters in that conference, you should tell someone as soon as possible. The quality of writing is often an interesting one, and this often gets confused in review forms. Sometimes what they're saying by quality of writing is the argument of the paper and the structure really clear and comprehensive and convincing? And sometimes they're saying, is the grammar and spelling good and bad? So I always try and separate those out mentally when I'm writing a review. And grammar and spelling can be fixed. A paper not being clear or being missing key information, that maybe needs re-reviewing. And once they fix that, so there's a distinction there between whether that matters. You can ask yourself how much literature is needed. They may have missed some papers, but there's so many papers out there that if it's got a good comprehensive set of papers, it may be good enough, or maybe one you want to add, but is it really a reject or not issue? Because is this paper critical to the fundamental nature of it, is what you're saying. You should be careful if you think, was the process good? You can't really say you should have done a different type of study. What you're saying is this type of study done well, and is it proving something or finding something that's important, and is that contribution clear? So be wary of, we sometimes get reviewers saying, oh, this would have been much better as an interview study. That's not really what your job as a reviewer is. Your job is to say whether what they did was good enough and be clear about that. The other thing you sometimes need to be careful of is different general philosophies behind the way work is done. We're often taught a certain way of doing things by our supervisors, and that comes from a certain disciplinary perspective. And you may find that other people do things differently, but still rigorously. And so one job you need to double check is, if it's not the way you would have done it, is the way they've done it rigorous and conforming to a way they specify as being relevant for the situation. The most common example of this I encounter is qualitative work. There are some versions of qualitative work where what you expect is a code book with definitions of all the codes and the themes and quantification of how often that came up. But there are some qualitative methods which are more about the insights you get, and they don't expect code books to be produced. And so as a reviewer, you have to try and understand what type of qualitative analysis they've done and what's expected in that case, and whether that's done correctly. And that may involve you comprehending a different approach and reading about it in order to judge that question carefully. So don't be quick to reject it because it's different to how you would have done it, basically. So then you're starting to come to your summary of recommendations. You've gone through all that thinking, what are you really saying now? This is your next job. What are we really going to say? What does this venue need to make a decision on? How are you going to articulate and help that decision? The workshop is just interested in, is it interesting to talk about? So you can quite quickly say, this is quite early work, but very interesting, very thought-provoking. We should accept it. The conference wants quality, but doesn't necessarily have time to do revisions, or maybe only has a short revision cycle, or maybe only has minor versions for the final version of the paper. So you're deciding, is it acceptable? And so all of your recommendation and your review has to come up to that one point. Is it acceptable right now? And with the journal, they want the quality. They're happy to do major reviewing. So all of your thinking and your recommendation for a journal article is typically what more needs doing to make this acceptable, and how much time do they need to do that, so you can help the senior reviewer know that. So now we're on to structuring the review. And I have 3 approaches that I structure reviews by, and it depends on the situation and what's good and bad about the paper to which one I pick. And sometimes the venue determines for me, but one thing that all these 3 structures share is a summary of the contribution. I always start a review with, this paper performed 2 experiments, and together from the results of those 2 experiments proved this and this. This shows that you understood the paper correctly, and if the author looks at your summary and goes, oh, that's not what we did, that helps them think a little bit about what was unclear about what they did. So beginning by articulating what you understood they did is an important step for everybody to know we're on the same page, and it was clear what was done in the paper. The last 2 bits are also in every type of review I write. The clear summary of your recommendation and the reasoning behind it. so we'll get to that again, but so many reviews that we get are missing the actual summary of the recommendation and the reasoning. So they do the previous steps, but they never actually say, because of X and Y and Z, I'm recommending this because I don't think it could be fixed in time for the conference this year. So therefore I'm recommending, it's got to have that explanation. Then the fourth step, which is the fourth one on this list, which is again in all of my reviews, is a list of any typos or added citations. It's kind of like metadata at the end, like you spelled this wrong on page 5, you spelled this wrong on page 12. There's an error in your graph on page 14, but it's not critical, it just needs improving. And I suggested 3 papers to add. These are the links to those 3 papers, like all that kind of additional faff that's not really part of the review. You probably mentioned them in the review, but the detail of them I stick at the end because it's like supplementary material almost. So the 3 structures then are by section, by criteria, and by problem type. And you can see the summary, the list of typos, and the summary of my recommendation on all of these 3 structures. So by section. So one approach is that you say, okay, the introduction. The introduction describes a clear problem. It's very strong. I'm not very convinced about this one issue, but this could be clarified quickly. I recommend you add this paper to that introduction. You comment on the introduction. What's good about it? Are there any major problems with this section? Are there any minor problems with this section? And then move on to the next section. So this, in some cases, works really well because you get to go through each bit of the paper and talk about its strengths and weaknesses and whether they're important. The second approach is by criteria. So this is if the conference has said, please comment on these 5 things. Then you go through and say, okay, the first one is about novelty of contribution. This is clear in sections 1 and 2, what the novelty is, and the discussion is also very clear about it. If there's some section about the technical detail, are any major problems with that technical detail, and where in the paper are the major problems? Are there any minor problems, and so on? So you're going by the criteria step by step and point to where in the paper is good and bad. And then the third one is by problem type. So then I'd say, okay, these are the strengths of the paper. The strengths are that it meets this criteria well and it meets this criteria well. There's a major problem in the paper and it's in the technical detail criteria, for example. And this is the thing that I think is most important that's wrong with the paper that means we can't accept it. And then some other minor problems I spotted were X, Y, and Z. So I go through the minor problems. And then I summarize, because of those big problems, this is my decision. So 3 different structures. And it's sometimes you're forced into, for example, this by criteria one. Sometimes the conference review form is like, we want you to comment on this, and we want you to comment on this. And so you're sort of forced into the structure. Sometimes it's just one big box, and you can find that either of these structures can make most sense depending on what's wrong. So if there's like a fundamental problem that's like throughout the whole paper, I might try this by problem size approach. If I want to comment by the different criteria, because I think some of the criteria are good and some of the criteria are bad, then by the criteria might work. If I want to talk about a major section of the paper that's not good and which criteria it breaks, then maybe by the section is best. So up to you to decide. As long as you have in all of them the summary of what you thought their contribution was, the summary of your recommendation with reasoning, and then the kind of extra important stuff at the end, like missing citations. Some things to remember to avoid. Don't be rude or criticize the authors directly. Remember, we're focusing on the paper. Is this paper ready? Is this paper got the right detail? Try not to just list all of your papers that they didn't cite, because I'm sure they didn't cite all of your papers. No one ever cites all of my papers. But you want to recommend papers they've missed that are relevant to what they're doing rather than could have cited, because some of them are relevant, if that makes sense. It's a common mistake to be like, oh, you didn't cite these 12 papers by Wilson. And then that just gives away who you are as well. And it's not really fair and balanced and objective. It's too personal. Don't suggest that they need to add more literature if you can't say what that literature is. If you're going to say that there needs to be papers they've missed and they need to add it, you should be able to say where they are. You can't say it doesn't cover literature without saying what those covers are. And yes, try not to say it would be better if they did something else. Remember, you're reviewing what they did and is it good enough? So final point for this video, we will look at how long should your review be, because we get plenty of reviews which are not long enough and not detailed enough. And so I think if you did all these things in my guidance back here, your review would be long enough. But this graph, I think, is interesting to see as an example. So on this graph, which I'm analyzing data from one conference in 2023, which is the HCI conference, we looked at which reviews got a mark of special recognition for being good quality reviews. and how long they were. And then we looked at how long all the other reviews were. So you can see the little dark bump at the bottom there is all the ones that got a special recognition. And the big peak, which is off to the left, only about 300 words, is all the other reviews. So you can see a good a couple of thousand reviews were pretty short, probably too short, if I'm honest. If I had a choice, I would make a review a minimum of 500 words, but there's some cases where that would be, too many. But you can see that the good quality reviews, the reviews that got a recommendation for quality, typically are longer. And actually, I got some more specific details about this. So the column on the left there is the ones that were given a high quality mark for being good. And you can see their average length was more like 1,000 words. And the median was 890. And the maximum we got was 3,700 words, so quite long reviews. The minimum we got in that case was 165 for still being counting as good. So it's possible to write a very good quality shorter review if it's really focused on something that is important and matters. But in general, we're looking at more like 1,000 words. For the reviews that were not given a recommendation for good quality, they span all the way down to only 33 words for a review, which is definitely not enough to be able to provide good quality feedback to people. And you see the average on average was more like 600 or 550, which is less detail. We did get some that were still, several thousand words, but ultimately what I'm saying here is you want to have lots of detail, lots of reflection in your review, and they should be by nature relatively long. Oh, yeah, some detail there. 1,621 reviews were less than 250 words. So that's quite a lot of reviews that year at the conference that were relatively short, is what we're saying. So we're hoping you'll be able to write some good constructive commentary in these reviews. So we just return quickly before we finish to these responsibilities, because I think across my slides, I've covered these issues about being objective and fair and fast and professional and confidential and being honest but also being courteous to people. These are really good traits to be if you want to be good at reviewing. And engaging in discussion and reflection about your reviews is really an important part of doing that as a professional. You're aiming to inform the program committee about whether the paper is suitable to be published, whether there's any problems with the paper and that it is novel. So 3 important bits, but also to give this constructive feedback. And so hopefully all the advice I've given you is to help you think about giving constructive feedback and to explain your reasoning. And I can't emphasize enough that reasoning at the end of every review. And this is what I practice in my course when I do this in person with people. We do practice examples. We look at example reviews and say, does this explain its recommendation? Is its recommendation clear? I have a few references here, which I hope are still active, but there's lots of guidance online for different types of reviewing. These are only a few examples. But that is the end of this video. So I'm hoping that will guide you to being an effective reader and also an effective reviewer for future conferences and venues and channels.